The icy December rain of Essex pounded fiercely against the bay windows of the detached house. Eve gripped her phone until her knuckles turned white. For 8 years of marriage, she and her husband Leo had visited every private fertility clinic in London, drunk countless herbal concoctions to regulate her body, and knelt in church every Sunday to pray. Everyone around her assured her that the timing simply wasn't right, and she had persuaded herself of the same, always guilt-ridden, that it was her own body failing Leo. She had even suggested adoption, but he had gently refused, saying he wanted to wait for their own flesh and blood. A missent picture message 10 minutes ago had shattered 8 years of self-deception in an instant. The photo came from her younger sister Lexi, sent by accident. In it, Leo sat on the edge of a maternity ward bed, cradling a pair of newborn twins, while Lexi leaned affectionately on his shoulder, her eyes brimming with undisguised sweetness. They both wore identical plain silver wedding bands. Eve stared at the photograph for a long time, her eyes so dry that not a single tear would fall. All she felt was a bone-deep chill. She walked to the study drawer, took out the divorce papers she had prepared beforehand, and calmly signed her name. No hysterics, no accusations, not a single argument to spare for Leo. That evening, Leo carried the twins and brought Lexi back to his mother Betty's old house in Colchester. The moment he stepped through the door, Betty caught sight of the 2 infants in their swaddling and her face drained of all color. She swayed and nearly fell. Leo, busy soothing the crying newborns, failed to notice his mother's distress. Casually he said, "Mum, these are mine and Lexi's children. I was planning to tell Eve in a while." Before he could finish, Betty seized his arm, her voice trembling uncontrollably, and blurted out in panic, "Wait. You mean Lexi never told Eve about this?" Leo looked bewildered, unable to fathom the strangeness in his mother's words. Just then, the doorbell rang softly. Eve stood in the pouring rain, the signed divorce papers in her hand, her calm gaze fixed on the 3 figures huddled inside. In Betty's flustered, evasive eyes lay a secret buried for 8 years, a secret that could destroy the entire family. The rain in Essex intensified sharply towards evening, dense drops like icy pellets hammering the Victorian slate roof of the Colchester old house. This late 19th century, detached residence stood on Melrose Road, its red brick walls stained dark by years of rain. 2 ancient oak trees in the front yard swayed wildly in the gale, casting dancing, ghostly shadows. Eve stood under the porch, rain streaming from the ends of her chestnut hair, soaking the shoulders of her camel-colored cashmere coat. She did not ring the bell a second time. She stood still, clutching the waterproof document bag that held the divorce papers. The December wind, laced with raindrops, lashed her face. Her eyes were as dry as parched wells, and the skin around them was raw and red. Through the narrow stained glass window beside the entrance, she could see the warm yellow light inside, hear the intermittent cries of a baby, and catch Betty's, her mother-in-law's, muffled, trembling exclamation. The old porch lamp swayed in the wind, casting a flickering patch of light and shadow at her feet, like an ill omen. Inside, Leo shifted the crying infant in his arms, patting the swaddling awkwardly, his brow furrowed. At 36, his dark brown hair was plastered to his forehead by the rain, his handsome features bore the weariness of days of running about. Beside him, Lexi was setting down a baby carrier. 3 years younger than Eve, 31, with long honey-blonde hair cascading to her waist, her soft profile bore a 5 or 6 out of 10 resemblance to Eve, though her eyes held a touch more ingenuousness and fragility. Betty stood in the center of the hallway, her 70-year-old frame suddenly seeming frail and bent. She wore a deep purple cardigan, her white hair immaculately pinned up. Now her wrinkled face was drained of all blood, even her lips an unhealthy gray. Her thin, bony fingers gripped Leo's forearm with such force that he winced in pain. "Mum? What's wrong?" Leo finally noticed his mother's strange reaction. He looked down at her, only to find that she was not looking at him or the baby, but staring directly at Lexi, her gaze a mixture of fear, shock, and an inexplicable despair. "Wait." Betty's voice was shrill, as if someone were strangling her. Her grip on Leo's arm trembled violently, her knuckles jutting out like dead twigs. Lexi never told Eve about this. The question struck Leo's nerves like a sharp needle. He froze, then instinctively turned to Lexi. Lexi's smile had stiffened under the light. She averted her gaze from Betty's burning stare and murmured, "Betty, Leo and I decided." "I'm asking you," Betty's voice rose, cracking with near hysteria. "Did you or did you not tell Eve?" The doorbell rang at that moment. It was not loud, just a single chime, no different from any ordinary visit. But in that instant, every person in the hallway, including the two newborns now placed on the sofa, seemed to freeze. Betty flinched as if electrocuted, let go of Leo's arm, staggered back half a step, and hit the hallway cabinet. A bone china vase on top wobbled with a sharp clink. Leo turned towards the door. Through the dancing shadows on the stained glass, he recognized the silhouette outside. In a flash, his expression shifted from confusion to shock, then to an indefinable guilt. He opened his mouth, instinctively trying to hand the baby to Lexi, but his arm froze mid-motion, looking absurd. Lexi's face went white. She stepped back, her calf bumping the baby carrier, which rocked slightly, making the newborn whimper. She bent to steady it, using the movement to hide her trembling fingers, but her gaze darted uncontrollably towards the closed door at the end of the hallway. "Open the door." Eve's voice came through the wood, calm beyond reason, blending with the cold rain outside, betraying no emotion. "I know you're in there." Betty closed her eyes. She had lived 70 years, survived war, famine, the loss of her husband, and thought nothing could ever unnerve her again. But now her heart pounded as if it would leap from her chest. A chill rose from her tailbone up her spine to the back of her skull. Gripping the edge of the cabinet to steady herself, she heard a voice buried for over 30 years thunder in her mind, making her temples throb. Leo took a deep breath, carefully placed the baby into the carrier beside Lexi, and walked reluctantly to the door. As his hand closed around the cold brass handle, he glanced back at his mother. Betty was staring at him with an expression he had never seen, fear, pleading, guilt, all churning in her cloudy grey-blue eyes, finally congealing into something close to supplication. He did not understand his mother's reaction, nor did he have the presence of mind to dwell on it. The handle was icy in his palm. He turned it, click, and the door opened. The cold wind and rain rushed in, making Leo squint. Eve stood on the porch, her camel coat half soaked, strands of hair clinging to her pale cheeks, her lips purplish with cold. She had no umbrella, rain ran down her forehead, over her nose, and dripped from her chin. Her eyes showed no sign of tears, just red, dry rims, and her gaze was clear as glass washed repeatedly in icy water. She was 3 years younger than Leo, 33, and came up to his chin. 8 years of marriage had left only faint lines at the corners of her eyes and a sharper, leaner cast to her face. Now she stood at the boundary between rain and lamplight, radiating a strange stillness, the dead calm that precedes a storm. "Eve?" Leo stepped aside, his throat tight. All the explanations he had prepared stuck in his throat. He had imagined countless discovery scenarios, Eve crying, smashing things, calling her family, but never this. Her calm unsettled him in a way he could not name. Eve did not look at him, nor at Lexi and the babies inside. Her gaze passed over Leo's shoulder and fixed on Betty. Betty leaned against the cabinet, ashen-faced, her lips moving soundlessly. For a few short steps, the two women stared at each other, and something invisible seemed to tremble in the air. "I've signed it." Eve pulled the papers from the bag. They were soft and damp in the humid air. Her voice was not loud, but it carried clearly to everyone inside. Leo, you just need to sign, and we're done. With that, she shifted her gaze from Betty and swept it unhurriedly over the two carriers by the sofa. The newborns were wrapped in pale blue swaddling, their tiny faces wrinkled. One whimpered weakly, the other slept soundly with clenched fists. Lexi crouched beside them, one hand guarding the carrier edge, looking up at Eve with a guilty yet stubborn expression. Eve regarded her own sister with no detectable emotion, as if looking at a stranger. After 8 years of swallowed grievances, anger, and bitterness, chewed over and digested this afternoon, all that remained were cold grey ashes. Eve? Lexi rose, her voice unsteady. It's not what you think. What do you think I think? Eve's tone stayed calm, even with a faint hint of a smile, but it never reached her eyes, hovering only on her lips like a thin paper mask, ready to tear. Do you think I'm wondering when you and my husband started sleeping together? When you conceived your children? Why you're wearing matching rings and leaning on my husband's shoulder in a photo you accidentally sent me? With each question, Lexi's face grew whiter until it was as pale as plaster. Leo stood between them, beads of cold sweat on his forehead, wanting to speak, but finding no defense. The facts lay there like shattered glass, each shard glaringly sharp, impossible to sweep away. 8 years. Eve's voice finally betrayed a barely perceptible tremor, like a deep undercurrent beneath a still lake. 8 years of drinking herbal medicine, endless tests, poring over every report, as if I could dissect my own body to find the flaw. You held my hand and said, "It's okay, we can wait." She looked at Leo, a sharp glint finally in her eyes. Every time you said that, were you thinking of my sister? Leo's facial muscles twitched. He opened his mouth, his voice dry as sandpaper. Eve, it's not. It doesn't matter. Eve cut him off, thrusting the divorce papers into his hand with a clean, final motion. Sign it or don't. If not, I'll have my lawyer handle it. As she withdrew her hand, her fingertips brushed his, cold as stones taken from ice water. She turned without hesitation, her coat hem swinging an arc, raindrops scattering on the stone porch. Leo instinctively reached to stop her, his fingers barely touching her soaked sleeve, but she yanked her arm away. Eve? Betty's voice came from inside, hoarse and urgent, trembling on the verge of collapse. Don't go. Eve stopped. She stood on the first step of the porch, rain gushing from the gutter at her feet, forming a swift rivulet. Without turning, she offered only her rain-drenched profile. Betty stumbled out of the hall, not even changing her slippers, stepping into the puddles. She grabbed Eve's wrist with a grip surprising for a 70-year-old, her age-spotted hands trembling, her nails nearly digging into Eve's skin. Child, listen to me. Betty's voice was low and urgent, as if afraid of being heard by those inside, or of being caught by someone. Rain soaked her white hair, streaming down her wrinkled face. Her eyes were red-rimmed, reflecting the porch light in fragmented shards, and the frantic panic in them made Eve's heart sink. I have to tell you something. Betty pressed her lips close to Eve's ear, her voice barely audible above the rain, her hot, uneven breath on Eve's cold ear raising goosebumps. Before Leo and Lexi know, before it's too late to fix anything. I've hidden this for 32 years. Eve stiffened. She turned to look into Betty's tear-filled eyes. Deep in that gaze, a secret long entombed by time was thrashing, like a trapped beast battering its cage, about to tear through the thin veneer maintained for over 30 years. What? Eve's voice came out raw. Betty's grip tightened. She took a ragged breath, her chest heaving, her lips moving several times before forcing out words from the depths of her throat. They seemed to come from far away, through decades of dust and regret, crashing into Eve's heart. Leo and Lexi. A violent gust of wind howled through the hall, swallowing the rest of her words. At the far end of the hallway, a half-open window slammed against the wall with a loud bang. Lexi shrieked, and both babies woke at once, their sharp cries piercing the rainy night. Leo rushed to close the window, and in the chaos, no one noticed Betty and Eve's conversation outside. But Eve, standing in the cold rain, watching Betty's moving lips, caught the end of that sentence through the wind, rain, and crying. In that instant, the document bag slipped from her fingers, the divorce papers scattering in the puddles. The paper quickly soaked through, and her black signature blurred like a slowly blooming ink flower. She stood rooted, her pupils contracting sharply, her face even paler than the rain-soaked sky. Betty's words had cut into the deepest part of her soul like an ice-cold blade. The 32-year secret now revealed its grim outline, and Eve realized that the betrayal she had suffered was nothing compared to the truth about to unfold, merely the most insignificant tip of the iceberg. At the hall's end, Leo closed the window and turned back, looking bewildered towards his mother and wife. Lexi crouched beside the crying babies, fumbling to soothe them, her face still marked with the shame of having been exposed. None of them knew that on the porch, in the rain, a truth that would swallow them all was seeping out from a 70-year-old woman's trembling lips. Betty gripped Eve's wrist with bone-crushing force. Tears mingled with rain on her face, salty as she remembered another stormy night 32 years ago, the baby taken, the decision she had spent half a lifetime concealing, forgetting, repenting. "I don't have much time," Betty's voice was hoarse and desperate, like a cornered old beast making a last stand. "Before I die, someone has to know." She spoke again, her voice shaking but now distinct. Each word fell like a heavy stone, one after another, into Eve's world, shattering the fragile edifice she had built over 8 years of self-deception. Inside, the babies kept crying. Leo walked towards the door, wanting to see what his mother and Eve were saying. Lexi looked up, her gaze passing over the carrier's edge to the two figures on the porch, a sudden inexplicable chill running through her. The rain continued. The December night in Essex stretched endlessly long. And the conversation on the Colchester porch was irreversibly rewriting the fate of everyone present. Betty held Eve's wrist tightly, rain running down their clasped hands, icy cold. She drew a deep breath, her chest heaving, her throat making a sound like an old bellows, and finally forced out the words that would shatter everything, one by one. "Leo and Lexi, they are biological siblings. Same mother, same father." The air seemed to freeze. Rain, wind, baby cries, furniture bumps, all sound vanished, leaving only the roar of blood in Eve's ears. She stared at Betty's lips, dry, cracked, still moving, but Eve could no longer hear. Her mind was an overloaded machine, every gear seizing at once, emitting white smoke. "What did you say?" Her voice came from far away, light and disembodied. Betty's tears mingled with rain, her face like old newspaper soaked through, every wrinkle holding years of silt. She gasped, her chin trembling like a drowning person gasping for air. 32 years ago, I gave birth to a daughter." Betty's voice was fragmented, like a smashed mirror, each shard reflecting old, harsh light. "My husband, Leo's father, said we couldn't afford a third child. He worked as a porter at Colchester docks, earning just enough to fill our stomachs. Leo and his brother already stretched us thin, another baby, and we'd all go hungry." Eve's knees grew weak. She reached out to steady herself against a brick pillar, the rough red surface abrading her cold palm, offering a faint sensation of reality. Her gaze drifted involuntarily inside, to the blonde woman crouched beside the baby carriers, her sister Lexi. The baby was given away. Betty's voice dropped even lower, as though the words had rusted under her tongue, each one scraping off a layer of flesh. "My husband said someone would take her, a good family. I never even saw her. I didn't know where she went, what she looked like, if she was cold or hungry. All I knew was that she had a small red birthmark behind her right ear, shaped like half a maple leaf. Eve's breath caught. Lexi had a small red birthmark behind her right ear, shaped like half a maple leaf. Eve remembered it so clearly, braiding Lexi's hair as a child. When the birthmark showed, she would call her Little Maple Leaf, and Lexi would giggle and dodge the comb, saying it tickled. "You're insane." Eve's voice squeezed through her teeth, her eyes wide, dry and sore, yet still unable to cry. "This can't be true. Lexi is my sister, and my parents. Did your parents ever tell you Lexi was their biological child?" Betty cut her off, her voice suddenly sharp, like a rusty blade unsheathed. "Think, Eve. Lexi is 3 years younger than you. After you were born, your mother's health was poor. Everyone in the neighborhood knew she couldn't have another. When you were 3, she was hospitalized for months. Do you know what surgery she had?" Eve's lips trembled. She didn't know. Her mother had always glossed over that time, evading questions. She only remembered flipping through family albums, thick stacks of her own baby photos, but only a handful of Lexi's, the earliest taken when Lexi was 3 or 4 months old. Her mother had said the camera broke, and Eve had believed it. She had believed everything. "You have no proof." Eve ground out the words. 32 years later, how can you claim Lexi is your daughter?" Betty released her wrist and, trembling, pulled a folded, yellowed piece of paper from the inner pocket of her cardigan. It was brittle, creases nearly tearing, the ink smudged where rain had touched, but still legible. It was a handwritten birth record, headed St. Mary's Maternity Hospital, dated 32 years ago, November 19th. Mother's name, Betty Grant. Sex, female. In the remarks column, a scrawled note, red birthmark behind right ear, maple leaf shaped. My attending midwife secretly kept this for me. Betty's hands shook so much she could barely hold the paper as rain blurred the ink. When my husband took the baby, I begged her to save this. For 32 years, I thought of her every day, searched for her every day. Your parents' names were the only information the adoption agency gave me. It took decades to confirm that Lexi was that child. But I never had the courage to claim her. I could only watch from afar, watch her grow up in your home, watch her call your mother Mum. Eve recoiled, her heel slipping on the wet stone, and she nearly fell. Her back hit the iron railing, the cold metal piercing through her coat, but she felt neither cold nor pain, only a wave of numbness spreading through her limbs. "So you knew Leo was your son?" Her voice became eerily calm, making Betty flinch. "When Leo and I got married 8 years ago, you knew. You knew Lexi was my sister, so you knew." She couldn't finish. "I thought it would be all right." Betty's tears flowed like a broken dam, mixing with rain. "I thought they'd just be ordinary acquaintances, like any in-laws. How could I have imagined, how could I imagine they would? When did you find out?" Eve's voice was devoid of warmth, like a scalpel fresh from the freezer, precise, cold, cutting to the bone. Betty shuddered as if struck. She dropped her gaze, not daring to meet Eve's eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "A year ago. I saw them together at the Colchester shopping center, Lexi with her arm linked through his. They didn't look like ordinary siblings. I felt the world collapse. I wanted to rush over and separate them, but I was too afraid. If I told the truth, Leo would hate me forever, Lexi would break down, you'd break down, everyone would. I thought it would end on its own. I told myself it was just a passing lapse." Eve let out a short, dry laugh, like glass grinding against glass, devoid of humor, leaving only the taste of blood. "A year." She repeated the word, her voice finally cracking. The crack widened, shattering the calm she had maintained. You knew for a whole year. You watched me stay in the dark, watched me think I couldn't have children, watched me kneel in church every Sunday, watched me cry alone in the bathroom late at night, and you just watched. Betty covered her mouth, her shoulders heaving with muffled sobs. The 70-year-old woman hunched in the rain, like an old tree broken by the storm, barely standing. Inside, Leo had secured the window and walked towards the door. His footsteps echoed dully on the wooden floor, each step bringing him closer to the abyss he knew nothing about. Eve bent down and picked up the soaking divorce papers from the puddle. The paper was limp and stuck together. Her signature had blurred into an unrecognizable black stain. She stared at the stain for 2 seconds, suddenly feeling it was a metaphor. She had thought a single document could draw a clean line, allow her to walk away, but fate never let anyone off that easily. Mum? Eve? What are you two saying out there? Leo's voice came from the hall, confused and slightly impatient. He stood at the threshold, rain dripping from the eaves onto his shoulder, frowning at his mother's tear-streaked face. Eve straightened and turned to Leo. In that moment, she saw her husband's face, the face she had looked at for 8 years, suddenly become utterly foreign. She searched it for traces of Lexi, for the similarities she had always overlooked. The arch of his brow, identical to Lexi's. The way he smiled. Leo stood at the junction of porch and hall, rain dripping from the eaves onto his shoulder, frowning at his mother's tear-streaked face. Mum? Eve? What are you two saying out there? Eve straightened up from the puddle, the soaked divorce papers hanging limply in her hand, her signature a blur. She stared at Leo's face, and suddenly it seemed like an oil painting splashed with water, colors running, features distorting into something monstrous and unfamiliar. Leo, she said, her voice steady to her own surprise, come inside. Sensing the tension, Leo stepped forward, his gaze darting between his mother and wife. Betty leaned against the brick pillar, drained, her white hair plastered to her forehead, lips moving soundlessly. What's wrong with Mum? Leo reached to help Betty, but she pushed him away. The push was weak, yet carried a finality that made his heart lurch. Go inside, Betty finally rasped, her voice like sandpaper on rough wood. I need to talk to you and Lexi. Lexi had already come to the end of the hall, holding one baby who had cried itself to hiccups, gently rocking the other carrier. Her gaze passed over Leo's shoulder to Betty, and her already pale face went even whiter, like peeling plaster. Betty, she said softly, with a pleading tone, it's cold out here. Let's come in. 10 minutes later, the old house's living room was heavy with damp chill. A fire had just been lit in the hearth, wood crackling, but it did little to dispel the bone-deep cold. The 2 babies were placed on the sofa, wrapped in dry blankets, gradually calming. Eve sat in the armchair opposite the fireplace, her wet coat draped over the back, her dark grey turtleneck clinging to her body, damp patches darkening at her waist. Her spine was ramrod straight, hands clasped on her knees, fingers interlocked so tightly her nails dug into her skin. Leo stood by the sofa, arms crossed. He had changed into a dry shirt, but his hair was still wet, strands of dark brown falling across his forehead, softening his features, yet his eyes grew more anxious by the minute. Mum, what is it? He asked for the 3rd time, impatience creeping in. Can you hurry up? The babies are hungry, Lexi needs to feed them. Lexi sat at the other end of the sofa, her back to the fire, half her face in shadow. She stared down, fingers twisting the edge of a blanket, her long honey-blonde hair hiding most of her face. Only Eve noticed the slight tremble in her shoulders. Betty stood by the fireplace, leaning on the marble mantel, her hunched silhouette dwarfed by the flames. She was silent for so long the fire died down, and Leo began to tap his shoe impatiently on the floor. Then she turned. A strange calm had settled on her lined face, like a drowning person finally surrendering, letting the current take her. Her gaze swept over each person, Leo, Lexi, Eve, then rested on the two swaddled infants on the sofa. In her cloudy grey-blue eyes, something too heavy was churning. "Leo," she said, quietly but clearly, "before your father died, did he ever mention that you were supposed to have a sister?" Leo froze. He frowned, searched his memory, then shook his head. "No. Dad never mentioned anything like that. Because he didn't want to." Betty's mouth twisted in a smile that wasn't a smile. "After he gave her away, he burned everything, birth certificate, baby clothes, the only photograph. He said it was as if she had never been born." Lexi's fingers, twisting the blanket, went rigid. Leo's expression shifted from confusion to wariness. He glanced at Lexi, then back at his mother. "Mum, what are you trying to say?" Betty wasn't looking at Leo. Her eyes were fixed on Lexi, the young woman in the shadows, her own daughter, who had never called her mum in over 30 years. "Lexi," Betty's voice softened, like ice melting into bitter, warm water, "you have a small red birthmark behind your right ear, don't you?" Lexi's head shot up. The firelight caught her face, illuminating the shock. Her lips opened and closed like a fish out of water, and she made a dry, wordless sound. "How do you know that?" she finally managed, her voice sharp and off-key. The room fell into an eerie silence. The fire popped, a log shifting, sending up sparks. One of the babies turned over, murmured, and went back to sleep. Leo stood between the sofa and fireplace, looking from his mother to Lexi, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning, unnamed dread. "Mum," he said in a low, careful voice, "have you known Lexi for a long time?" Betty closed her eyes. The moment stretched, as if an entire river flowed beneath her lids. 32 years, every sleepless night, every time she had watched Lexi from afar, every letter written and torn up, every pretend encounter at the supermarket just to catch a glimpse. When she opened her eyes, tears were already rolling down her wrinkles. "Lexi is my daughter," she said. The words were light as a feather on the water, but they raised a storm. 32 years ago, I gave birth to her. Your father gave her away. The family who adopted her, they were Eve's parents." Leo's face froze solid, like a wax figure doused in ice water, every detail locked. His lips stayed slightly parted, he blinked, then blinked again, and his pupils slowly, inexorably dilated. Lexi sprang up from the sofa. She rose so fast her knee banged the coffee table with a dull thud, but she felt nothing. She stared at Betty, her eyes swimming with tears, her voice torn from the deepest part of her chest. "You're lying." "I'm not." Betty pulled the damp birth record from her pocket and held it out. It trembled like a dead leaf in the wind. St. Mary's Maternity Hospital, November 19, 32 years ago. Mother, Betty Grant. Female infant. Red maple leaf birthmark behind right ear. Look for yourself. Lexi didn't take it. She stood frozen, staring at the yellowed paper, as if it were invisible. Her breathing grew rapid and shallow, her chest heaving, her lips turning gray. Leo moved. He took the paper, looked down at it. His hands were shaking too, barely able to hold the brittle sheet. The ink was blurred in places, but the key details were clear. He read it once, then again, then handed it to Lexi, his movements stiff as a puppet's. Lexi finally took it. She lowered her head, her long hair hiding her face, only her knuckles showing bone white around the paper's edge. She stared for a long time, until another log was added to the fire and the rain outside began to let up. Then she let out a short, sharp laugh, like glass scratched with a nail, piercing everyone's ears. When the laugh faded, her voice was eerily calm, as if someone else were speaking. So, she looked up at Betty, her eyes red, but dry as burning coals. Leo and I, we're biological siblings. Lexi. Leo reached for her. Don't touch me. Lexi shrieked, stumbling back, her back hitting the tall grandfather clock behind her. The pendulum swung violently, emitting a low hum. The birth record slipped from her fingers, fluttered to the floor, stirred by the fire's warm air. The living room was like a ship hit by a giant wave, everyone flung off balance. Eve still sat in her armchair, hands still clasped on her knees, but her rigid posture had loosened, her shoulders sank slightly, as if something had finally crushed her taut strings. She watched the scene, Leo standing helpless, one hand still in the air, reaching for Lexi, Lexi huddled by the clock, arms wrapped tight around herself, sobbing in broken gasps, Betty hunched by the hearth, tears streaming, repeating, I'm sorry like a broken record. And Eve, at the center of it all, felt as if she had been pulled far away, watching a silent play through thick glass. No anger, no sorrow, only an empty, snow-covered stillness. She remembered a summer 7 years ago, when she first brought Leo to her parents' home. Lexi had just returned from university, her hair in a high ponytail, wearing a floral dress, helping their mother slice fruit in the kitchen. Leo went in for ice water, and as he passed Lexi, their arms brushed. Eve, flipping a magazine on the sofa, glanced at them and thought, it's nice that my sister and my husband get along. Nice. Eve bent and picked up the soaked divorce papers from the floor. She spread them out, the ink had blurred beyond recognition. She clutched the soggy mess and suddenly felt like laughing, at herself, at these 8 years, at her belief that a single document could end everything. It was far from over. She understood now. Leo, she said. Not loud, but everyone fell silent at once, even Lexi's sobs stopped. 3 pairs of eyes turned to her. She rose and walked to Leo. She was a head shorter, yet now she had to look slightly down at him, because she stood 1 step above, on the higher floor, while he stood on the sunken carpet. The slight height advantage felt absurd. Whose children are they? She asked. Leo opened his mouth, his face flushing with deeper shame. He instinctively looked at Lexi, as if for guidance. Lexi flinched, her face nearly translucent. You ask me whose children they are, Eve repeated, her calm beginning to crack. I married you for 8 years, drank hundreds of herbal doses, knelt in church 1,000 times, and you tell me the children belong to someone else. Now you tell me that someone else is your own sister. Leo, did you ever? She stopped. The firelight glinted in her eyes, scattered like shattered amber. Leo's face burned crimson. He moved his lips several times before forcing out, I didn't know. I mean, when I met Lexi, I didn't know she was my. When did you sleep with her? Eve cut him off, her voice sharp as a whetted blade. I want the truth. You don't need to protect anyone anymore. Leo swallowed hard. He dropped his eyes to a dark stain on the carpet, his voice muffled, 3.5 years ago. You had your period that week. I went to a bar for a drink, and she came to find me. We'd both had too much. 3.5 years. Eve savored the number, like chewing glass. We'd been married 4.5 years then. Do you know what I was doing at that time? Taking Chinese medicine, 3 bowls a day, so bitter-eyed wretch. You came home from the bar, reeking of alcohol, said you were too tired from work and passed out. I curled at the foot of the bed with a hot water bottle, biting my wrist so I wouldn't wake you. Leo's face went white. You were together for 3.5 years, Eve continued, her tone flat, as if reciting an unrelated report. You had countless chances to tell me. You could have told me when she got pregnant. But no, you waited until Lexi accidentally sent me that photo. Tell me, if I hadn't seen it today, how long would you have kept it from me? Leo had no answer. Lexi stumbled up from the floor, wiping tears across her face, leaving red streaks, her eyes swollen. She looked at Eve, trembling, and finally said, "Eve, I was the one who approached him first. Don't blame Leo." "What did you call me?" Eve turned to her, and something in her gaze made Lexi freeze. Lexi opened her mouth, but the word Eve stuck in her throat. She suddenly realized, if Betty was telling the truth, Eve was not her biological sister. There was no blood between them. The word she had said thousands of times over 31 years was now a complete lie. "You don't need to take the blame for him." Eve looked away, her voice returning to that chilling calm. "He made his own choices. Both of you did." She bent down, picked her wet coat off the armchair, and shrugged it on with practiced resolve. Then she walked to the sofa and looked down at the two swaddled babies. Tiny, wrinkled faces, one asleep, mouth working as if dreaming of milk, the other awake, dark eyes moist, turning vaguely in Eve's direction. Eve gazed at them for a long moment. For an instant, her eyes grew moist, but she blinked hard and forced it back. She reached out, barely touching the awake baby's cheek with her fingertip, feeling the cotton-soft skin, then withdrew her hand. "I'm going," she said. "Eve," Betty struggled to straighten from the mantel, her voice hoarse. At the door, Eve paused. She didn't turn, only offered her profile. "Betty, you've hidden this secret for 32 years, and now you've told it. Are you relieved?" Betty's mouth hung open, tears streaming, unable to answer. "You're relieved," Eve said softly. "But everyone in this house will never be at ease again." She pushed open the door and stepped out. The rain had eased to a fine drizzle, like grey mist. Night had fully fallen, streetlights on Melrose Road cast soft orange halos through the fog, and the oak leaves swayed, scattering fractured shadows. Eve didn't drive. She walked south along Melrose Road, not knowing where to go, only knowing she couldn't stop. If she stopped, everything she had suppressed would surge up and drown her. The drizzle landed on her face, cool and fine. Her coat was still wet, clinging to her body, growing colder, but she didn't feel it. After about 10 minutes, she stopped under a bus shelter and bent over, hands on her knees, gasping for air. Eventually, she straightened. The fluorescent light of the bus shelter's ad sign lit up her face, revealing the unshed tears in her eyes. She stared at her reflection, pale face, blue lips, red dry eyes, hair straggling, like a crumpled piece of paper barely smoothed out, full of creases. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, a message from Leo. "Where are you? It's still raining. I'll come get you. Let's talk." She stared at the message for a few seconds, her thumb hovering, then powered off the phone. As the screen went dark, a night bus approached, its headlights cutting through the mist, illuminating the rain-soaked sign above the shelter. Eve looked up. This bus went to London, via Chelmsford, terminating at Liverpool Street. She raised her hand. The bus pulled over, the doors opened, and warm yellow light spilled out with a wave of dry heat. The driver glanced at her, startled by her soaked appearance, and hesitated. "Miss, are you all right?" Eve nodded and stepped aboard. The bus was nearly empty, a few passengers with earphones or dozing. No one noticed her. She took the last window seat, and the old house was swallowed by fog and night behind her. The bus moved off, tires hissing on the wet road. She leaned her forehead against the cold glass, watching the streetlights slide past like a broken necklace. Colchester faded into open fields and scattered farmhouse lights, flickering in the rainy dark. She pressed her forehead to the glass and closed her eyes. Everything she had suppressed began to churn, 8 years of memories, from the sunlit wedding church, to the disappointment of each test result, to Leo's arm around her saying it's okay, we can wait, ending with that photo on her phone. A single tear finally escaped, running down her nose and falling onto her clasped hands, cool, like a raindrop. The bus rolled steadily through the wet night, deeper into the dark. By the time the bus reached its terminus, it was nearly 11 at night. Eve stepped off, standing under the station's canopy, looking at the rain-slicked streets and occasional cars. London's night was brighter than Colchester's, but that brightness was cold, neon lights bleeding colourful halos through the damp air, people hurrying past, no one noticing a soaked woman standing under the canopy. She walked aimlessly for a while, then found a 24-hour budget hotel nearby. The clerk gave her a cursory glance, assuming she was another late-night lost soul, handed her a key with a faintly sympathetic remark, "Hot water runs until 2 in the morning." The room was small, a single bed with grey-white sheets, cheap polyester curtains letting in a dim streetlight glow. Eve closed the door, peeled off her wet coat and sweater, and went into the bathroom, turning on the hot water. Scalding water poured over her icy skin, raising a prickling sting. She stood under the spray, letting it wash over her head, shoulders, back, water streaming down her body to swirl into the drain. She stared at the circling water, then slowly slid to the tiled floor, burying her face in her knees. The hot water continued to rain down, steaming up the glass, droplets forming. She crouched there, her shoulders beginning to shake, first gently, then violently. She bit her wrist to stifle the cries, but broken sobs still escaped, mingling with the water like a dying animal's low moan. She didn't cry long. Perhaps she was too exhausted, or perhaps the tears had dried up in countless late nights of the past 8 years. As the water cooled, she got up, wrapped her hair in a thin towel, and put on the only dry thing she had, a light grey cotton nightgown she had grabbed from her closet, folded in her bag before the rain got to it. She lay on the bed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling. The mattress was soft, like a swaying little boat. Her gaze blurred in the darkness, and exhaustion finally overcame her swirling thoughts. She fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, the rain had stopped. Sunlight crept through the cheap curtain, painting a thin golden line on the floor. Eve lay for a long time, staring at that line, her mind blank, as if someone had rebooted her, and all the chaotic data hadn't yet reloaded. Then memory returned, like ice water poured over her head, the scenes, the voices, Betty's trembling lips, Lexi's white face, Leo's suspended hand, all flooding back. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and sat up. The phone had been off since last night. She hesitated, then powered it on. Notifications flooded in, 17 missed calls from Leo, 5 from Lexi, 3 from Betty, and 1 from her mother. She stared at her mother's call record for a long time. The contact was saved as Mum. She imagined her mother sitting in that old house in Essex, clutching the phone, lips pressed tight, probably having already guessed something. Eve returned none of the calls. She turned the phone face down on the bedside table and got up to wash. The mirror showed a haggard face, swollen eyes, cracked lips, sallow from lack of sleep. She splashed cold water on her face, tied back her hair roughly, put on the now mostly dry coat, checked out, and walked out. London had a rare clear December day, a cold, pale blue sky, sunlight glittering on the wet streets. Eve walked west along Liverpool Street, past a cafe, and stepped in for a hot Americano. She sat by the window with her coffee, watching the passers-by, commuters, tourists, a young mother pushing a pram, an old man with a dog, each with their own expression, hurried, leisurely, weary, cheerful. She felt like an observer behind glass, watching the world run on its tracks, while her own track had completely derailed. She thought hard about what to do next. Divorce was inevitable, even if the paperwork had been ruined, she could reprint and sign. She had a premarital flat in West London, currently rented, but the lease ended this month. She could move back. She worked as an assistant curator at a gallery. It didn't pay much, but it was enough to live on. These practical matters, she could list and check off clearly. But the things beyond the list, her parents' house, the annual Christmas dinners, the scarf Lexi had knitted for their mother's birthday, the apple tree she and Leo had planted together. They were scattered throughout her memory, each holding warmth, each reminding her that everything she had ever had was, at its root, false. After finishing her coffee, she finally called her mother. The phone rang twice before a voice answered, Winifred's, soft and cautious, Eve. It's me. Eve's voice was dry, she cleared her throat. Where are you? I kept calling last night and it was off. Her mother paused, then lowered her voice. Your father's not home, he's at the supermarket. Tell me the truth, is Lexi? Mum, Eve cut in, you knew Lexi wasn't your biological child, didn't you? A long silence. Eve thought the call had dropped, checked the screen, still connected. Then she heard her mother inhale, a deep breath, as if pulling something from the bottom of her heart. In the autumn when you were 3, her mother finally began, her voice carrying the weariness of years. I had a serious illness, and had my uterus removed. The doctor said I could never have another child. Your father and I had always wanted 2 children, ideally a boy and a girl, but heaven wouldn't give us that. She paused. Eve heard light breathing and the faint sound of something being knocked over. Then someone approached your father, saying there was a baby girl who needed adopting. The couple, the family, didn't have formal adoption papers. They were too poor to meet the agency's requirements. Your father and I went to their place, a rundown flat in Colchester. They were young. Betty had just given birth a few days earlier, wrapped in a headscarf, lying in bed, sallow-faced. The man pulled your father onto the balcony, and said they couldn't afford a 3rd child and hoped we could give this girl a home. Eve's knuckles whitened around the phone. Your father agreed. When we took the baby, Betty struggled to get up and run after us, but the man held her back. I turned back at the stairwell. She was clinging to the door frame, her face white as paper, not crying, just watching us walk down step by step. Her mother's voice finally trembled. I'll never forget those eyes. She had a red birthmark behind her right ear, Eve said, flat, as if stating a fact unrelated to herself. Yes. Her mother sighed, a soft breath like a falling feather. We named her Lexi. Your father said, one foo, one lie, a matching pair. Eve closed her eyes. Sunlight through the cafe window fell warmly on her face, but she felt like an ice sculpture. When did you find out that Lexi married Betty's son? She asked. Another long silence. Her mother's voice, when it came, held a barely perceptible guilt. On your wedding day. Betty came to the church, and when she saw Lexi in the back pew, I saw her expression. I just thought it odd at first, then I looked up her address and asked around. Her husband had died long ago, and she had a son, the man you married. And you just watched. Eve opened her eyes, her voice finally rising. Some customers glanced her way, she lowered it, but the tremor persisted. You and Betty, you all knew, all of you, and you watched me. I wasn't sure, her mother cut in, tearfully. I wasn't sure that Leo was the brother of that baby, I just suspected. And by then you were already planning the wedding, you were so happy, so radiant, how could I say anything? What if I was wrong? What if it was just a coincidence? It wasn't a coincidence, Eve said. Her mother fell silent. The cafe door opened and closed, letting in a cold draft on Eve's neck. She shivered. Staring at the bright street outside, she felt the absurdity of it all. The 3 most important women in her life, mother, sister, mother-in-law, each held a piece of the secret, each chose silence, and each used that silence to push her into an 8-year marriage, all waiting for the secret to break. And herself, what role did she play? Someone who walked blindfolded for 8 years, every step on a path laid by others, never seeing the cracks beneath. Eve, her mother's voice came through, pleading, come home. Let's talk face to face. Your father doesn't know about Lexi and Leo yet. I haven't told him. Tell him. Eve stood, put her cup in the return tray, and walked out. The sun cast a long shadow on the ground. Enough secrets have been kept. I'm not coming back, at least not until I can face you and Dad with a clear head. She hung up and stood on the London street, breathing deeply. The air still held last night's dampness, mixed with exhaust fumes and the smell of fried onions from a hot dog stand. She took in those scents, as if confirming she was still alive, still standing in this real world. The next 3 days, she stayed in her West London flat. The tenant had moved out early. She changed the sheets, bought basics from the nearby supermarket, and stocked the kitchen. The flat was small, 1 bedroom, a living room, east-facing windows, and every morning sunlight streamed in, illuminating the wood grain of the floor. She left her phone off, shoved in a drawer with old keys, expired coupons, and unopened candles. She used her old laptop to handle work emails. She took a week's leave from the gallery, and the director replied briefly, "Rest well, let me know if you need anything." On the 4th evening, someone knocked at her door. Eve was boiling noodles in the kitchen and paused. She hadn't given this address to anyone. She went to the peephole. Lexi stood under the corridor light, wearing a dark green parka, her hair a mess, her face worse than 3 days ago, hollow-eyed and gaunt, as if she'd lost weight in days. Her hands twisted in front of her, her toes scuffing the floor. Eve didn't open. She leaned against the door, listening through the wood. Lexi knocked twice more, softer this time. "Eve?" She called, then corrected herself, "Eve. I know you're in there. Your mailbox downstairs has a utility bill with your name on it." Eve took a deep breath and opened the door. Lexi stood there, her eyes red and swollen, clearly just crying. The moment she saw Eve, her lips began to tremble, tears spilling down, wordless. "Come in," Eve said, stepping aside. Lexi stumbled in, as if she had been standing outside for so long her legs were numb. She sat on the sofa, accepted a cup of hot water Eve handed her, and stared down at the surface without speaking. Eve sat opposite her, the 2 women separated by a low coffee table. Outside, the winter dusk was falling rapidly. Only a floor lamp was lit in the flat, casting long shadows on the pale walls. After a long time, Lexi looked up. Her eyes still brimmed with tears, but she was more composed. Her voice hoarse, she began, "I left the babies with Betty. She said she could watch them for a few days. Leo is ordering a DNA test." Eve said nothing. "He said whatever the result, he'll take responsibility." Lexi's mouth twisted bitterly. Responsibility? He doesn't know how ridiculous that sounds now. He doesn't even know who he is. How can he be responsible for anyone else? "And you?" Eve asked. "When did you find out?" Lexi's fingers tightened around the cup. Her gaze dropped to the water's surface, her voice shrinking. "The day I sent you that photo. That afternoon I was helping Betty tidy up at her house, and I found an old album in the attic. There was a picture of Betty young, holding a baby, and the baby's swaddling had a name embroidered, Lexi. I thought it was odd and asked Betty. She kept dodging, but when I pressed, she finally said, 'That's a photo of you as a baby.' I asked how she had a photo of me. She didn't answer, just kept crying. I left with the photo, my heart racing, my hands shaking as I drove. Then, on impulse, I sent that family picture to your phone. I meant to send it to Leo, but I hit the wrong contact." She began to cry again, her voice breaking. I didn't know why I sent it to you at the time. But later I realized. I wanted it to come out. I couldn't take it anymore. 3.5 years. I felt like I was suffocating, yet I couldn't let go. I didn't know what to do. I wanted you to know, but I was more afraid of you knowing. And then I sent that picture. 5 seconds later I regretted it, but it was too late. Eve listened, her heart feeling as if it were being ground by something blunt, not sharp, but persistently painful. She looked at the woman crying in front of her, her sister, or the woman she had thought was her sister, and suddenly didn't know what attitude to take. Anger. Of course. The betrayal was the sharpest knife of the past 8 years. But watching Lexi huddled on the sofa, shoulders heaving with sobs, she found that anger was now wrapped in something more complex, a strange absurdity and sadness. The person crying before her was, from the start, just another poor soul caught up in fate's machinations. Both of them had been swept into this chaos, standing on different positions. Do you love him? Eve suddenly asked. Lexi looked up, tear blurred, opening her mouth, but not answering. Do you love Leo? Eve repeated, her tone calm, not accusatory. Not the thrill of an affair, not the excitement of secrecy. Do you love him? Whether he's your brother or not, do you still love him now? Lexi's lips moved several times, and finally she squeezed out one word from deep in her throat, yes. After saying it, she seemed drained, collapsing into the sofa, wrapping her arms around her knees and burying her face. I know it's wrong. It was wrong from the start. But feelings, they're not something you control. I tried, I really did. We broke it off twice, the longest time 2 months with no contact, but every morning the first person I thought of was him. I can't control it. If I could, would I have ended up like this? Eve watched her curled up and remembered something from many years ago. The summer Lexi was 15, their old cat died. Lexi sat on the back steps, holding the cat's body, crying all afternoon, impossible to console. Her mother had said Lexi had always been like that, soft-hearted, too emotional, plunging headlong into whatever she loved, impossible to pull back. Back then, Eve thought it was her sister's most endearing trait. Now she didn't know how to define that soft heart. After the DNA results come out, Eve said, "What will you do?" Lexi's shoulders shook. She lifted her face, eyes swollen, sniffing. Leo says whatever the result, he'll raise the children with me. He says, even if we really are siblings, the babies are here, and he can't abandon them. And your relationship? Your and his relationship? Lexi fell silent. She looked down, then up, a look of numb weariness. He also said that if we are siblings, he'll move out. We'll take turns with the children. We'll only be family. Can you do that? Lexi didn't answer. A bitter smile flickered on her lips, as if saying, do you think I can, but she didn't voice it. The last of the day's light faded, and night closed over London. The floor lamp cast a small warm circle on the floor, its edges melting into shadow. The two women sat at opposite ends of that light, like two sides of a river. Her phone rang, Lexi's. She glanced at the screen, her expression shifting. It's Betty. Probably about the babies. She answered softly, then her voice turned urgent. What? When? Eve watched her face go pale again, a bad feeling rising. Lexi hung up, stood so fast she knocked her knee against the table, and rushed out. Betty fainted. In the kitchen, hit her head on the counter. Leo called an ambulance. We're going to Colchester Hospital. Eve was out the door almost at the same moment. The emergency corridor hummed with fluorescent lights, cold and harsh. Eve and Lexi arrived to find Leo sitting on a plastic chair at the end, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. He looked up at their footsteps, and a complex emotion flickered across his face at seeing them together. "How is she?" Lexi hurried over. "No immediate danger." Leo's voice was dull, strained from sleeplessness. "Moderate concussion, 5 stitches on her forehead. Still under observation. She collapsed while heating milk for the babies. Thank God she didn't drop them." He paused, his gaze moving between the two women, finally settling on Eve with an unreadable expression: guilt, unease, something Eve couldn't name. "Eve, you came." Eve didn't meet his eyes. She looked at the closed emergency door, light seeping through the crack, faint monitor beeps inside. She leaned against the opposite wall, hands in her pockets, silent. Leo stood and walked to her, stopping 2 steps away, not daring to come closer. He opened his mouth a few times before forcing out, "That night, what I said, don't hold it against me. I genuinely want to talk properly." "About what?" Eve finally looked at him. The fluorescent light revealed the quiet weariness beneath her calm. "About your DNA results. Or about how you two will raise the children." Leo choked. His hands clenched and unclenched, his throat moved, and his voice dropped. "About us. You and me." "Us?" Eve repeated the word softly, tasting an unfamiliar sound. "Leo, tell me, do we still have an us? The night you had too much with Lexi at the bar 3.5 years ago, us was already gone." Leo's face grayed, his lips pressed tight. He looked at the floor, silent for a long time, then whispered, "I'm sorry." Those 3 words drifted in the empty corridor, landing like a fallen leaf, picked up by no one. Lexi sat on the plastic chair, hands twisted in her lap, head bowed. The corridor was quiet except for the hum of lights and occasional beeps from the emergency room. After about 20 minutes, the door opened. A doctor in blue scrubs came out, removed his mask, and scanned the 3, family. Leo and Lexi stood up at once. The doctor gave them a professional glance, suppressing any curiosity, and said evenly, "The patient is awake and conscious, no signs of intracranial bleeding. However, given her age, the fall has put extra strain on her heart, so we recommend a few days of observation. You can see her, but not too many at once, she needs rest." When Leo pushed open the door to go in, Eve remained where she was. Lexi hesitated, turned back to Eve, seemed to want to say something, but only nodded and followed. Eve leaned against the wall, watching the half-open door. Warm yellow light spilled out, and she heard Betty's weak voice speaking, fragmentary. A few minutes later, Leo emerged, looking troubled. "She's asking for you," he said softly. Eve looked at him and walked in. The room was small, a bed, a nightstand, simple decor. Betty lay propped against the raised headboard, a thick bandage on her forehead, her face sallow, eyes half closed. At the sound of footsteps, she opened them, and upon seeing Eve, a glimmer of tears appeared in her cloudy grey-blue eyes. "Child," she reached out, her hand bearing in 4, blue veins visible under thin skin. "Come here." Eve walked to the bed and sat in the chair beside it. The room was quiet except for the faint beeps of the monitor. Betty clasped her hand, dry and warm, with the coolness of the 4 line. She held Eve's fingers lightly, as if holding something fragile. "I had an ECG," Betty began, her voice soft and slow, each word costing effort. "The doctor said my heart is much weaker than a normal 70-year-old's. All these years, too much strain. Too much weight on my mind." Eve said nothing, just looked at her. "I keep thinking," Betty's fingers tightened slightly, "if I had never said anything that night, maybe everything could have gone on. You and Leo divorce, go your separate ways. Lexi raises her children. Leo sends me money, comes home on weekends. Everyone pretends nothing happened, that the window was never broken. Do you think that would have been better? Eve asked. Betty was quiet for a moment. She closed her eyes, let out a faint sigh. I don't know. I really don't know. But the moment I said it, when I said Lexi is my daughter, I felt the stone that had pressed on my chest for 32 years lift. I'm not afraid of dying anymore. I said it before I died. I won't take it to the grave. She opened her eyes, looking at Eve. Those eyes, cloudy and old, held a clarity washed clean by tears. But in lifting that stone, I placed it on you. I'm sorry. I was selfish all my life, and selfish to the end. Eve looked at the elderly woman in the hospital bed, and suddenly recalled the wedding 7 years ago. Betty, wearing a smart navy suit, had sat in the second row, crying throughout the processional, wringing a handkerchief. Eve had thought it was a mother's joy at her son's marriage, but now she understood. Betty had watched Leo walk down the aisle with Lexi's sister, watched the couple exchange rings, watching her 2 biological children's lives become entangled in this grotesque way. Why didn't you tell us earlier? Eve finally asked. Her voice was quiet, but carried weight. When Leo and I met, when we started dating, when we got engaged, at any earlier moment. Why? Betty's lips trembled. She stared at the ceiling, tears sliding into her grey hair. I tried once. 3 months into your relationship, Leo came for dinner, and I mentioned, you actually had a sister, but she was given away. He was eating, didn't even look up, just said, Mum, stop making up stories. Dad never mentioned a sister. I was weak. He didn't want to hear, so I didn't push. Later, the longer I waited, the harder it got. She turned to Eve, her eyes pleading. I know nothing I say now matters. I don't ask for your forgiveness, I don't dare. I'm just afraid I won't see you again, before I close my eyes. Eve withdrew her hand. The motion was gentle, but as Betty's fingers released, Eve saw a flicker of loss in the old woman's eyes. She stood and walked to the window. Outside lay the night of Colchester, a few lit windows in distant buildings, the occasional passing car. Get well, she said, her back to Betty, her voice unreadable. Let Leo and Lexi handle their own affairs. Take care of yourself. She turned and left the room. Leo and Lexi were outside. Lexi's eyes were redder than before, Leo's expression grim. They had evidently heard at least some of the conversation. Eve walked between them, not stopping. Leo called after her, Eve. She paused. The results are in, he said, his voice complex. The official report comes tomorrow, but I've already asked. Eve turned to face him. Leo stood under the harsh fluorescent light, his face worn and tired. He took a breath and spoke the result, we're biological siblings. In the corridor, a moment of silence. Lexi's tears spilled silently, she covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking violently, trying to hold back sobs. Leo stood still, hands at his sides, clenching and unclenching. Eve looked at them. The corridor's wall lamp cast a fan of yellow light, enclosing Leo and Lexi, while she stood outside that patch, a line of light and shadow at her feet, a boundary she could never cross. She said nothing, turned, and walked into the darkness at the end of the hall. Behind her, Lexi's stifled cries and Leo's low murmurs echoed briefly, then faded into the hum of the fluorescent lights. As she stepped out of the hospital, the dry winter wind hit her. Eve stood on the steps, looking up at the dark blue sky scattered with faint stars, dimmed by the city lights. She exhaled a plume of white breath, watched it dissipate, and walked into the December night. The DNA result changed everything, and yet nothing. Leo moved out of the marital home. He rented a small 2-bedroom flat in Colchester, 3 streets from Betty's old house, and hired a daytime nanny for the twins. After leaving the hospital, Betty's health declined, she needed a cane to walk, and Leo would bring the babies to her for dinner every evening. Lexi did not move in with Leo. After the confirmation, she seemed hollowed out, returning directly to Eve's parents' house. Winifred took one look at her gaunt, pale face, said nothing, only guided her inside and made her a bowl of hot soup. Lexi sat before the woman she had called Mum for 31 years, took a sip, and tears fell into the bowl, mixing with the broth. That night, after Lexi fell asleep, Winifred called Eve's father into the study. The two spoke behind closed doors for nearly 2 hours. When they emerged, her father's face was ashen, and he sat motionless on the sofa for a long time, like a weather-beaten stone. The next morning, he called Eve. Eve answered in her West London flat, hearing her father's voice, hoarse, with the heaviness of a sleepless night, and her chest tightened. Eve, her father began slowly, each word weighed. Your father made many mistakes in his life. The decision to adopt Lexi was mine. Your mother was ill and couldn't decide. I didn't think about the future, I just wanted a sister for you. Eve held the phone, sitting on the windowsill, sunlight slanting through the blinds in parallel lines on the floor. She stayed silent. Then things turned out this way. Her father's voice paused, then deepened. I don't blame anyone. The root of this is me. If you want to blame someone, blame me. I don't blame anyone, Eve finally spoke, her voice calmer than she expected. Dad, every person in this story made their own choices. You chose to adopt, Betty chose silence, Leo chose betrayal, Lexi chose to be with him. Every choice has its cost. Now everyone is paying that cost, including me. A long silence. Then her father inhaled and exhaled slowly. When will you come home? He asked. In a while, Eve said. In a while. After hanging up, she sat on the windowsill for a long time. The blind cast light moved slowly through the morning, from her feet to her knees to her clasped hands. She watched the light shift inch by inch, feeling time become tangible. It flowed on, taking some things, leaving others, never stopping for anyone's pain. Mid-December, Eve returned to the gallery. Her colleagues had heard something from the director, but no one asked. They left a small potted plant on her desk with a handwritten note, "Welcome back." She sat down, opened her computer, and waded through a week's backlog. Curatorial work was mundane and concrete. Exhibit lists, shipping arrangements, installation timelines, press releases, each task like a sturdy stake, anchoring her back to the ground. She methodically worked through emails, took calls, had a sandwich with colleagues at the cafe, and spent the afternoon in a meeting discussing the new exhibition's circulation. By the time she left, night had fallen. London's December streets glowed with Christmas lights. Shop windows displayed gift boxes and nutcrackers. Eve walked among the crowd, swept up in the festive atmosphere, yet feeling a faint distance, like watching a celebration from behind a pane of glass. Back at her flat, she found a manila envelope in the letterbox. No return address, only her name written neatly in pen. She recognized the handwriting, Leo's, with its lean, elongated strokes, like the man himself, outwardly crisp and decisive, but always with something held back. She carried it upstairs and opened it on the sofa. Inside was a printed divorce agreement, already signed by Leo, dated that day. The terms were more generous than her own draft. The marital home went to her, all joint savings were transferred to her account, and Leo took only his car and personal belongings. At the bottom was a handwritten note, 2 lines. Eve, if you're willing, sign anytime. The house and money are yours by right. I'm sorry. Leo. Eve read the note twice, folded it, and placed it in the coffee table drawer. She didn't sign the agreement, nor did she mail it back. She couldn't quite say why. It just didn't feel like the right time to close the chapter. Christmas Eve, Eve received a call from Lexi. She stared at the caller ID for a moment before answering. Lexi's voice was hesitant. Eve, tomorrow's Christmas. Mum, I mean Winifred, wants you to come for dinner. Dad does too. If you'd rather not, they won't push. Eve held the phone, standing by her flat window. Outside, London was dusted with fine snow, white specks spinning in the streetlight glow. Lexi, she said, are you still at Mum and Dad's? Yes. Lexi's voice dropped. I'm looking for a place. I'll move out after New Year's. To Colchester. A few seconds of silence. Not sure yet. I haven't decided. Eve watched the snowfall, a swirl of complex emotions rising. She remembered Lexi at 15, sitting on the back steps, sobbing over the dead cat. Lexi as her bridesmaid at 22, teary-eyed, adjusting her train. All those evenings they had curled up on the sofa watching old movies, sharing a bucket of popcorn. Those memories wouldn't vanish with the truth, but they were forever stained a different color. Like an old photograph drenched in water, the image still there, but the hues forever changed. Tomorrow's dinner, Eve said, I'll come. A soft exhale on the other end, as if Lexi had been holding her breath. Really? Really? Eve paused, then added, tell Mum to make extra roast potatoes, the last batch was too salty. Lexi let out a small, teary laugh, trying not to cry. Christmas lunch, Eve drove alone from London to her parents' home in Essex. The snow had stopped overnight, the roads were clear, flanked by winter-brown fields and occasional bare oaks dusted with melting snow. Her parents lived in a semi-detached house on the outskirts of Chelmsford, with a row of hollies in the front yard strung with coloured lights, cheerful and lonely under the grey sky. As Eve parked, she saw the kitchen window glowing, figures moving inside, her mother's silhouette stretched by the stove. When she entered, everyone in the living room fell silent for a moment. Her father sat in an armchair, a newspaper in his hands, his eyes reddened at the sight of her. Her mother peered out from the kitchen, flour on her apron, lips moving as if to speak, but only nodded and retreated. Lexi sat on the sofa, in a light blue sweater, her hair loosely braided, looking better than 2 weeks ago, though dark circles still shadowed her eyes. Eve hung her coat and placed a box on the coffee table. Some chocolates from Paris. A colleague brought them back. Her father rose and hugged her, brief and light, as if afraid of breaking something, but Eve felt the tremor in his arms. She patted his back and said softly, I'm fine, Dad. He turned away, quickly wiping his eyes. At the lunch table, the four sat around a spread of roast turkey, mashed potatoes, Yorkshire pudding, and roasted vegetables. It was their quietest Christmas meal in 31 years. Her mother still piled food on Eve's plate. Her father still cut the tenderest turkey breast for Lexi. Lexi still poked at her roast potatoes with a fork. The old habits remained, but the air above every gesture had changed. Halfway through, Lexi put down her fork and spoke. Her voice was not loud, but everyone heard. I'm moving to Scotland. Eve looked up. Her mother's spoon stopped mid-motion. Her father paused in carving the turkey. A publisher in Edinburgh gave me an offer, Lexi continued, keeping her eyes down, tracing the gravy on her plate with her fork. I applied last month, didn't expect much, but they called last week. It's an editorial assistant role, not high pay, but enough to live on. I want to start over somewhere new. Silence. Her mother set down her spoon, her voice tight. When do you leave? After New Year's. My lease ends this month, so I'll pack and go straight there. Her father murmured and went back to carving, but Eve noticed his knife moved slower, sawing back and forth before cutting through. Lexi looked at Eve, a cautious question in her eyes. What do you think? Eve leaned back, studying Lexi's face, still strikingly similar to her own, but now carrying a resolve Eve had never seen before. the resolve of someone who, though scared, had made a choice and would not waver. "Go for it," Eve said. "You can always come back if it doesn't work out." Lexi's eyes brightened for an instant, then dropped again. She nodded and resumed poking her potatoes. Her mother went to the kitchen for dessert, passing Lexi and pressing her hand lightly on her shoulder, holding it for 2 or 3 seconds, as if all the words of a lifetime were in that brief touch. After Christmas, Eve stayed at her parents' for 2 nights. She slept in the room next to Lexi's, her childhood bedroom, still with the floral cotton sheets her mother changed every year. Lying in bed, she heard Lexi's occasional turnings and coughs through the wall, thinking that tomorrow she would return to London, Lexi to Scotland, and her parents would stay in this little house in Chelmsford, the 4 of them beginning a new arrangement unlike any before. She slept fitfully, half dreaming, hearing her neighbor's door open and close, the flush of the bathroom, soft footsteps in the hallway, familiar sounds from a summer afternoon in her childhood, carrying the scent of sunshine and cicadas. On the first weekend after New Year's, Eve went to Colchester. She needed to collect some things from Betty's old house, books and clothes from the marital home that she hadn't taken after Leo moved out. The house was empty now, and she meant to take what she could use and dispose of the rest. When she drove up Melrose Road, the red brick walls showed dark water stains in the pale winter sun, the 2 oaks were bare, their branches reaching skyward. The old porch lamp, unlit, looked shabby in daylight. She unlocked the door and found it already open. Pushing inside, she heard the cooing of a baby and Betty humming a lullaby. The living room fire was burning. Betty sat on the sofa, holding one infant. The wound on her forehead had healed to a faint pink scar. She looked much better than in the hospital. Seeing Eve, she paused, then smiled warmly, wrinkles gathering at her eyes. "Come to collect your things?" Betty asked. Eve nodded. "Some books and clothes. I'll be quick." Betty carefully placed the baby into a carrier, then pushed herself up from the sofa, moving slower than before, her knees visibly struggling. "Go ahead, I won't bother you. There's hot water in the kitchen, help yourself." Eve went upstairs to the master bedroom. It looked much as she had left it, but Leo's belongings were gone, half the wardrobe empty, his shaving cream and aftershave missing from the dresser, and the photo frame from the bedside table had left an oval dust mark. She packed a few everyday clothes, selected her favorite art books and novels from the study, and gathered toiletries from the bathroom. Not much, 1 large travel bag sufficed. Carrying it downstairs, she found Betty back on the sofa, now holding the other baby, who blinked with black eyes and blue spit bubbles. A steaming cup of tea sat on the coffee table, with a second untouched cup clearly meant for Eve. Eve sat down opposite Betty and took a sip of the tea, black with a little milk, not too sweet, just right. The 2 women faced each other, with the baby between them. Winter sunlight streamed through the south-facing window, warming the worn floral carpet. The fire crackled contentedly, occasionally sending up sparks. "Where's Leo?" Eve asked. "At work." Betty stroked the baby's cheek with her thumb. "He transferred to a local architectural firm in Colchester, closer to home, so he can care for the babies and me." "Lexi?" "Lexi left 2 days ago. She came to see me before she went. She held both babies for a long time, her eyes red, but she didn't cry. She said she'll come back to see them when she's settled." Eve didn't reply. She looked into her tea, watching the ceiling's reflection on the surface. "Eve?" Betty's voice grew soft, carrying the huskiness of age. "I owe you something." Eve looked up. "I'm sorry," Betty said. The words came out with a slight tremor, as if she were finally shifting a stone from her chest. The baby in her arms stirred, waving its tiny hand. "I shouldn't have kept it hidden, whatever the reason, fear of hurting anyone," Fear of breaking anything. I should have told you from the start. It was my fault things became what they are. Eve set down her teacup and looked at her. The old woman's cloudy eyes held a thin film of tears. The faint scar on her forehead was like a riverbed carved by time. Eve realized Betty had truly aged, much more than a few months ago. That fall had been a dividing line, turning 70-year-old Betty into someone entirely different from 71. You didn't make it all happen alone, Eve said, her voice as flat and warm as the winter sun. Everyone made their own choices. You chose silence, Leo chose betrayal, Lexi chose secrecy, I chose self-deception. Each of us made our choices, and now we all bear the consequences. It's not solely your fault. Betty looked at her, tears spilling down her wrinkles. She didn't wipe them away, letting them fall onto the baby's blanket, leaving dark spots. Eve stood and picked up her travel bag. At the door, she paused and looked back. Betty was bending over the baby, wiping drool from its mouth, her profile gilded by the firelight. It was an ordinary scene, a grandmother tending to her grandchild on a winter afternoon. She pushed open the door and stepped out. The air on Melrose Road was cold. Her breath formed white puffs that dissipated. Eve put her bag in the boot, got into the driver's seat, and started the engine. She drove along Melrose Road, past the two bare oaks, glancing in the rearview mirror as the red brick house shrank behind her. The sun was bright, the sky a pale winter blue, cloudless. She looked forward and pressed the accelerator, merging smoothly onto the main road. Ahead lay the motorway to London, broad and flat, bordered by empty winter fields and grey-brown towns in the distance. She didn't know what would happen next. The divorce papers were unsigned, days would keep passing, the gallery work would continue, life would carry her forward. The things that had been crushed, trust, marriage, her entire notion of home, could never be repaired, like a broken cup glued back together, the cracks forever visible. But as she drove in the winter sun, listening to an old song on the radio, she felt she wasn't as broken as she had imagined. The cracks were there, yes, but she was still a whole cup, able to hold hot and cold, to contain water, to be held in someone's hand. The motorway stretched to the horizon, sunlight gleaming silvery on the asphalt. She squinted slightly, shifted gear, and drove steadily towards that brightness ahead.